Okay, so compulsory licensing is basically when one company has a patent and that company abuses the patent in a number of ways. Either, for example, will not make it available, not register the drug locally, or it's too expensive for the patients to buy, or for NGOs like MSF to buy, or the government to buy. Then you can give the right to produce the same drug, even though there's a patent, to another company or to several companies. So what happens is then the price starts falling because multiple producers. So that's what a compulsory licensing is. It's basically to deal with the abuse of the patent system.
So it's a local protection for...
Absolutely. It's well recognized in international law. So countries can sort of bring it into their own law and implement it. So the Thais have done it quite extensively. They are the first country who issued more than HIV. They did heart disease as well. There are several applications for patents, for compulsory licensing pending in the Indian Patent Office also. Yeah.
So in many African countries that have been pushed to tackle drug counterfeit drugs. Is that different from patent law? Because countries are coming under pressure from European and American companies to pass anti-counterfeiting laws related to drugs, medicines.
Yeah, indeed that's quite confusing, especially if you work on, one part of access is also quality. So you obviously, that has been, but what really happened was they brought intellectual property into counterfeiting, into the definition of counterfeit. So actually nothing to do with quality, it had everything to do with IP enforcement. That's when groups like civil rights groups, MSF and others said, let's not mix up the two. If you want to deal with quality, there are several measures that you can take, including, you've had a WHO recall, you can strengthen the FDA, there are several measures you can take. But let's not mix up intellectual property, patents into the counterfeiting law. So that's when the confusion has arisen. Of course, it's a very well funded campaign by pharma. So, even in India, there are absolute junkets that are being run for journalists on counterfeit drugs. On the other hand, the positive aspect has been that the Indian FDA has started to take quality concerns from African countries very seriously and has started to strengthen the FDA, because they realize that drugs go from India to other countries, so it's not merely about local needs. They need to ensure the drugs actually. So they did a whole audit of the API producers and they suspended about 10 API sources because they were not up to the mark. So they now started to move on quality because they realize the drugs are going out of the country. Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges you foresee in sort of getting the patent laws changed in South Africa?
Well, actually, I think it's just getting the campaign off the ground is the biggest thing. I think South Africa's had such a history of working with among the lawyers and the networks together. So once you cull out what you really want to change in your patent law, the main thing is to build a campaign around it, and it shouldn't just be a South African campaign. It should be a campaign that all of us support, because every time a country changes a patent law which is pro public health, it benefits a lot of other countries as well, because then they can follow that example. Philippines did that. They basically took a look at the Indian situation and said, okay, this is great, we can actually examine the application and actually rule out a number of applications because they are new use or new form of an old drug. So of course there's a lot of interest from around the world to support the South African campaign. So just getting it off the ground will be the main issue fundamentally for me, I think. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. I want to know if is there a way that we can find a balance between the pharmaceutical companies that produce or invent new life-saving drugs versus the fact that developing countries will need these life-saving drugs without the unfair laws of patenting them. So is there a way so that they don't get discouraged in many years to come to say, what's the point? You produce, they come, say, no, but what you invent us with this and we can't kind of get back our business.
Okay, so when I started to do intellectual property work, I actually used to think that companies won't do any R&D unless you give them intellectual property. So actually R&D itself works in a number of different ways. For example, how much does government put money? You know, which scientific institutions are sharing technology, collaborating with each other. So it's not just a simple matter of just granting the IP or not granting the IP that will determine R&D. The companies want us to think like that. The other fundamental issue is that you can even manage patents in a different way. For example, the compensatory model, which the Indians support wholeheartedly. If you have a patent on a new drug, give us the license, we'll pay you the royalty. So you earn your profits, but we can make it affordably. But saying that we will have a monopoly, we will set the price, we will not give you the technology is not acceptable to us. So that kind of IP model which kills a lot of patients is not acceptable to us. Because also the problem really is that we have the Indian constitution, the right to health is a constitutional right, but a patent right is a privately held right. So how can you put a constitutional right to health below a privately held right? So you have to protect the constitutional right to health before you protect a private right. So in India we sort of see this, we'll pay the royalty, new drug, let's come to a fair royalty and let's get on with the job of producing drugs. So what guarantee is that even if you grant you the patent, you will register the drug in my country? There are many small countries who grant the patent, but in the end they never get the drug. Because the company just wants the patent to block access, but doesn't want to sell the drug at affordable price. It doesn't even register. So it doesn't even go to your FDA to register. So what's the point of giving such monopolies which are of no use ultimately to the public? Because the whole notion of patents was that it was meant for public good. In law, that is why we grant patents, not because we like profiteering. So unless it fulfills that, so there are several issues, and I must say I don't have all the answers. But as a civil rights lawyer, I believe that if there's a drug that can save a patient's life or improve it, then that's the first criteria we have to fulfill. Yeah. Okay, then we last question and we move on. Yeah.
Okay, quickly, it's a sort of a follow-up question to that one, and it's a question of tactics. Should we, how much of our limited organizational resources should we be devoting to looking for fundamental reform of the intellectual property rights regime, and how much on incremental fights that can have an immediate impact? For example, your challenges to...
Yeah, so our experiences of in the Indian context, that even when you want a fundamental change to your patent system, has been when a lawyer goes with a patient to court and says, this drug is too expensive, I want access to it. If legal aid lawyers fail their duty to represent patients, that's when the courts step in and start protecting constitutional right. If you can get that framework going in any country, which South Africa has and India has, then you can talk about a far more fundamental change. Because the court cases bring their own campaigns around them, and actually doesn't become about the individual patient or the cost of that drug alone. We in India are struggling to provide legal aid on hepatitis C, on cancer, HIV. The battles are so many, the patients are so many. Should I represent the woman who has breast cancer and needs Herceptin? Should I represent the patient who needs Hep C drug? Should I represent just work on AIDS? These are the challenges for the civil rights movement. And what has happened is that all international funding for legal aid on HIV AIDS or access to medicine is drying up. So they don't want the lawyers to go out and fight for their patients or to fight for their clients. And I think that has been the biggest tragedy in the Indian context. Because if that dries up, then the battles will dry up. That is what my experience was. That's how I came in touch with MSF. Because these were the doctors who wanted their patients to live. And one of the things that MSF wanted to do was, even if it supported a court case, it would do so. It was not being a petitioner, but also supporting court cases and campaigns around it. And it did so brilliantly because it stood by its patients. So similarly, I think in India we have the same problem. So most of our fights are actually around court cases or like a free trade agreement. So that's reactive. So that's how we've. Thank you.
way back when